I watched my wife Diana slide an envelope across the table at her parents' Christmas dinner, and the way she looked at me told me everything I needed to know about what was inside. We were surrounded by family, her mom Carol bringing out dessert, her dad Richard pouring wine, and Diana had this expression I'd never seen before. Pure anticipation mixed with something darker. Her sister Ashley was next to us with her kids, her brother arguing with his wife about something trivial, and the whole house smelled like pine and cinnamon. Diana pushed the envelope toward me with 2 fingers, her red nails tapping against the paper, and she said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Open it. This is your real Christmas present." The way she emphasized the word real made people look up from their plates. Her mom thought it was something sentimental. Her dad raised his glass, expecting an announcement about a promotion or maybe another baby. I opened it slowly, and the first thing I saw was the letterhead from a DNA testing lab. My hands went cold. The results were right there in clinical black and white. Max, my 6-year-old son, the kid who'd just fallen asleep upstairs after opening his presents. The kid who called me daddy and hugged my leg every time I walked through the door. 0% probability of paternity. I read it twice because surely there was a mistake, but the numbers didn't change. 0%. No margin for error. Max wasn't mine. The table went quiet. Her mom stared at the envelope in my hands. Her sister stopped cutting her pie. Even the kids seemed to sense something was wrong. Diana leaned back in her chair, took a sip of her wine, and started talking before anyone else could say a word. She told the entire table that she'd stopped loving me 2 years ago. Just said it out loud, casual as anything. Pierce Hamilton, my colleague from the corporate campus and supposed friend, had been giving her what I couldn't. Stability, she called it. Emotional connection. Her mom's face went pale. Her dad set down his wine glass so hard I thought it might crack. But Diana kept going, and what she said next was so calculated that I realized she'd been planning this public execution for a long time. She'd been waiting for my company to complete its acquisition, waiting for me to pour everything into building something valuable. Max wasn't an accident. He was insurance. She'd gotten pregnant deliberately, put my name on the birth certificate, and waited. Waited while I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing everything to build financial security. Waited until the $2.3 million sale went through last month, and now she was filing for divorce. She'd take half of everything I'd built, plus child support based on my new $180,000 income, and walk away set for life. My share of the company sale was $920,000 after taxes. Our house had appreciated to nearly $480,000. Combined with retirement accounts and investments, we were looking at close to $1.8 million in total assets. She'd calculated it all. Even had lawyers lined up charging me $25,000 just for the privilege of watching my life get dismantled. She'd been documenting everything for months, building a case that I'd accepted parental responsibility, which meant the courts wouldn't care about biology. In her mind, I was trapped. The law was on her side. She'd already won. Her mom started crying. Her dad stared at Diana like he didn't recognize his own daughter. Her sister grabbed her kids and took them into the other room, but Diana just sat there waiting for me to fall apart. Waiting for me to beg or cry or make a scene she could use against me later. I could see it in her eyes. This was her moment of triumph. 8 years of marriage reduced to a calculated business transaction. The weird thing is, I didn't feel angry. Just this cold, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. Because here's what Diana didn't know. I'd known about all of this for 6 months. Every detail of her plan, every move she thought she was making in secret. And while she'd been setting up her endgame, I'd been building my own case. Brick by brick, document by document. The company acquisition had closed in November, and I'd been waiting for her to make exactly this move. I looked at her across the table, at this woman I'd once loved enough to promise forever to, and felt absolutely nothing. I set the DNA test down carefully, smoothed it out like it was just another piece of paper, and looked her dead in the eye. Check your email. For the first time that evening, her confidence faltered. That tiny crack in her armor. She pulled out her phone with this confused look, probably expecting some desperate message she could show her lawyer, some angry rant, some proof that I was unstable. I watched her face as she opened her email. watched the confidence drain away like someone had pulled a plug, watched her eyes go wide as she started scrolling. The divorce petition my lawyer had prepared, ready to file the moment she made her move. The detailed timeline of her affair with evidence attached, the fraudulent paternity documentation, the recordings I'd been collecting for months. Every conversation where she'd mentioned her plan to Pierce, every text message she thought she'd deleted, every piece of proof that this wasn't a marriage falling apart. It was a calculated con job from the start. Her hands started shaking. The phone nearly slipped from her fingers. All the color drained from her face. Her dad leaned over to see what was on the screen. Her mom was asking what was happening, but Diana couldn't speak. She just kept scrolling through page after page of evidence, watching her entire master plan collapse in real time. Screenshots of conversations going back 3 years, financial records showing her secret preparations, documentation of Pierce's visits to our house when I was traveling for business. I stood up from the table. Her whole family was staring at me now, some confused, some starting to understand. I looked down at Diana one last time. Everything you just told everyone, I've known for 6 months. Every plan you made, every scheme you thought you were 10 steps ahead on, I was 20 steps ahead of you. And the second you announced your intent to file for divorce in front of witnesses, you gave me exactly what I needed to beat you to the courthouse. I walked out of that house, leaving her sitting there at her parents' Christmas table, surrounded by the family she'd just humiliated herself in front of, staring at her phone as her carefully constructed scheme fell apart. I got in my car, drove to the hotel I'd already booked, and called Jonathan Hart, my lawyer. He was waiting for my signal. Within an hour, he'd filed everything electronically: the petition, the evidence, the emergency motion for temporary custody. By the time Diana woke up the next morning, the legal machinery was already in motion, because Diana had made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed I'd be too devastated to think straight, too heartbroken to fight back, too stupid to see what was happening until it was too late. She'd spent years underestimating me, treating me like I was just a wallet with legs. And that underestimation was going to cost her everything. The whole thing started 6 months before that Christmas dinner. And it started because Max got sick. Nothing serious, just needed a sports physical for school soccer, but the pediatrician wanted to run a full blood panel after some concerning symptoms during his checkup. I took him to the appointment because Diana claimed she had a work meeting, which should have been my first warning sign. The nurse drew the blood. Max handled it like a champ, and I took him out for ice cream after. 2 days later, the pediatrician's office called and asked if I could come in to discuss the results in person, which made my stomach drop. I showed up expecting to hear about some serious health issue, already mentally preparing for treatment plans. The doctor closed the door and had this uncomfortable expression. She started by saying Max was perfectly healthy, no major concerns, nothing to worry about. But then she paused. She told me that when they ran the blood panel, they noted Max's blood type, type B positive. And according to their records, I was type O positive and Diana was type A positive. She explained very gently that it was genetically impossible for two parents with O and A blood types to have a child with type B blood. She said sometimes there are errors in records, but she wanted to bring it to my attention. I sat there processing what she'd said. The doctor wasn't accusing anyone, she was just pointing out a genetic impossibility and letting me draw my own conclusions. I thanked her and walked out to my car on autopilot. I didn't go home. I drove straight to a private lab across town, one that advertised discreet DNA testing for legal cases. I paid extra for expedited results. They said 72 hours. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I went through the motions at home, playing with Max, having dinner with Diana, pretending everything was normal. The email came at 2 o'clock in the morning. I grabbed my phone and went into the bathroom to read the results. 0% probability of paternity. I read it multiple times, checking every number, looking for any sign this could be wrong. But DNA doesn't lie. Max wasn't my biological son. I sat on that bathroom floor trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to wake Diana up right then and demand answers. But a smarter part of me told me to wait, to be strategic, to find out exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. I lay there the rest of that night next to my wife and started thinking about all the little things I'd ignored. The way she'd discouraged genetic testing at birth, the comments about how much Max looked like her side of the family, how she'd pushed me to work longer hours, focus on the business, leave parenting to her, how she'd insisted on keeping our finances mostly separate until the company sale, How she'd asked me to sign papers updating our business structure. Papers I'd barely glanced at because I trusted her. How she'd been strategically supportive of my travel schedule, encouraging me to take those week-long trips to close deals. Every warning sign suddenly became blindingly obvious. The next morning, I called Jonathan Hart, the best divorce attorney in the city, a guy with a reputation for handling complex cases involving business assets and custody disputes. His retainer alone was $15,000, but I knew I'd need the best. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he told me I needed to move very carefully. If Diana was planning what he suspected, she'd likely been building her case for months. The fact that I'd been acting as Max's father for 6 years meant I had established legal paternity regardless of biology. If I confronted her now, I'd lose everything. He told me to document everything, but not to do anything illegal. Every receipt, every email, every interaction. We scheduled weekly meetings, and he started building a counter case. I started keeping detailed records. Every expense I covered for Max, every soccer practice pickup, every parent-teacher conference. I backed up all our joint financial records to secure servers. For 6 months, I played the oblivious husband while collecting evidence, and Diana had no idea. At work, the situation became more complicated. Pierce Hamilton worked in our corporate campus, different division but same company. We'd grab lunch occasionally, talked about weekend plans, kids' activities. He'd even been to our house for barbecues. The betrayal cut deeper because of how normal everything seemed on the surface. I had to maintain professional relationships while knowing he was sleeping with my wife and planning to help her destroy me financially. My colleagues started noticing changes in my behavior around Pierce. I became more reserved, stopped initiating conversations. A few of the guys I was closer with asked if everything was okay. I kept my responses vague, but I could tell they sensed tension. The corporate environment made everything more complicated because I couldn't afford to create workplace drama before I had all my evidence together. About 2 months in, something unexpected happened. Diana's sister Ashley called me, crying, barely coherent. We met at a coffee shop across town, away from anywhere we might be seen. She told me she'd accidentally seen text messages on Diana's phone when she was borrowing it to call an Uber. She felt sick about it, but thought I deserved to know. Ashley had always been the good one in that family, the one who still believed in doing the right thing. She showed me screenshots, messages between Diana and Pierce going back years. They'd been involved since before Max was born. The messages were explicit about Pierce being Max's biological father, about how Diana had deliberately gotten pregnant and put my name on the birth certificate. But the really damaging content was what came later. Messages where Diana laid out her entire strategy. How she was waiting for my company's sale to finalize. How she'd researched exactly what she'd be entitled to in a divorce. How Max was her leverage because courts typically favor mothers. How she planned to maximize child support while she and Pierce lived comfortably off my money. She even had a timeline. January, right after the holidays, when the sale proceeds would be fully settled in my accounts. Everything was calculated down to the month. Ashley showed me messages where Diana discussed waiting for the optimal moment, when my net worth would be at its peak. She'd been tracking my business progress, monitoring the acquisition negotiations, timing everything perfectly. Ashley gave me dates and conversations she'd overheard when Diana thought no one was listening. She became my secret ally, reporting back everything she witnessed. When Diana needed someone to watch Max, Ashley would volunteer and quietly document things. Phone conversations Diana had with Pierce when she thought she was alone. Times Pierce came by the house during his lunch breaks. Everything Ashley witnessed, she reported back to Jonathan. The workplace dynamic became increasingly awkward as I continued building my case. Pierce and I were assigned to a joint project in October, which meant regular meetings and collaboration. I had to sit across conference tables from him, discussing quarterly projections and market strategies, while knowing he was planning to help destroy my life. He'd make casual references to weekend plans, ask about Diana and Max. The level of deception was staggering. During one particularly surreal meeting, Pierce mentioned he was thinking about buying a house, asking my opinion on different neighborhoods. I realized later he was probably scoping out areas where he and Diana could live once they had my money. The audacity of asking my advice while plotting against me was almost impressive in its brazenness. My colleagues definitely noticed something was off. Mike from accounting asked if Pierce and I had some kind of professional disagreement. I kept my responses neutral, professional. A few of the guys I played poker with monthly started commenting that I seemed distracted, stressed. I blamed it on the acquisition process, post-sale transition issues. Nobody suspected the real reason. The worst part was watching Diana with Max during those 6 months. She was a good mom in many ways. She loved him, took care of him, never missed a soccer game or school event. But I also knew from those messages that she saw him as an asset. She told Pierce that having a child with my name on the birth certificate was the smartest strategic move she'd ever made. That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for my money or my business. I was fighting for Max, because I was the only father that kid had ever known. I'd been there for his first steps, his first words, every nightmare that woke him up at 3 a.m. I'd taught him to ride a bike, coached his little league practices when the regular coach was sick. I'd sat through countless parent-teacher conferences, helped with homework, read bedtime stories every single night. And I wasn't going to let Diana use him as a bargaining chip in some elaborate financial scam. By December, Jonathan and I had everything. 6 months of documentation, screenshots from Ashley proving the affair and the conspiracy, financial records showing Diana had been moving money into separate accounts, evidence that she'd consulted with 3 different divorce attorneys months earlier. We had detailed logs of my involvement in Max's life, video footage from school events, testimonials from teachers and coaches about my role as his father. Ashley had agreed to testify, despite the family pressure she'd face. Jonathan told me we had one of the strongest cases he'd ever seen, but we needed to wait for Diana to make the first move. We needed her to announce her intent publicly, in front of witnesses, to give us legal standing to file immediately and aggressively. The strategy was to let her think she had complete control, then hit back with overwhelming force before she could react. We prepared everything meticulously. The petition was written and reviewed multiple times. The evidence was compiled into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss. The custody motion was crafted to emphasize my role as Max's primary emotional and practical father figure, regardless of biology. All we needed was for Diana to show her hand. The waiting was the hardest part. Knowing what was coming, watching her prepare for what she thought would be her moment of triumph. She'd started dressing better, going to the gym more regularly. She was getting ready for her new life with Pierce, funded by my years of work. She even bought new luggage, probably planning some kind of celebration trip once the divorce was final. Meanwhile, I was having conversations with divorce financial analysts, preparing asset protection strategies, researching custody precedents in cases involving paternity fraud. The legal fees were adding up quickly, but Jonathan was worth every penny. He'd handled cases involving executives, professional athletes, people with significant assets to protect. He understood the psychology of high-stakes divorce litigation. The company Christmas party in mid-December was particularly awkward. Diana attended as my spouse, smiling and socializing with colleagues who had no idea what was coming. Pierce was there too, chatting with the same people, playing his role as the friendly colleague. Watching them interact, knowing what I knew, was almost surreal. They were so confident, so certain they had everything under control. 3 days before Christmas, Diana made a comment that confirmed everything. She said she was looking forward to the new year, that she thought it was going to be a time of major changes for our family. She had this satisfied smile when she said it, like she was already savoring her victory. That's when I knew she was ready to make her move. Jonathan had prepared me for this moment. All the evidence was ready. The legal strategy was locked in. We just needed her to take the bait. Then she handed me that envelope at Christmas dinner. She'd made her move. She'd announced her intent to divorce in front of multiple witnesses. She'd revealed her entire plan, thinking I had no way to fight back. That night in the hotel, I gave Jonathan the green light. He filed everything electronically within the hour. The divorce petition, with fraud allegations, all our evidence, an emergency motion for temporary custody. By morning, everything we'd spent 6 months preparing was officially in the court system, and Diana was about to find out that underestimating someone doesn't just leave you vulnerable, it leaves you completely defenseless. The temporary custody hearing was set for 2 weeks after New Year's, and Diana showed up looking like she'd aged 10 years. Her lawyer was one of those guys who charges $800 an hour to look intimidating, but I could see the concern on his face the moment Jonathan started presenting our case. The judge was a woman named Helen Crawford, and she had a reputation for having zero tolerance for parental manipulation. Jonathan had specifically requested her courtroom. She sat there with reading glasses perched on her nose going through our documents, and her expression got darker with every page. Diana's lawyer tried to start with the standard approach, talking about maternal bonds and established routines, and how disruptive it would be for Max to change his living situation. Judge Crawford held up one hand and cut him off. She asked if he'd actually reviewed all the evidence. The lawyer stumbled through some answer about needing more time, and the judge's expression made it clear what she thought about that. Then Jonathan stood up and walked the court through our case. He started with the blood test that had triggered my concerns. Then the DNA results proving Max wasn't biologically mine. He showed the timeline of the affair documented through Ashley's testimony and evidence going back 5 years. But the really damaging material came next. He presented messages where Diana explicitly discussed using Max as leverage, where she calculated child support based on my projected income, where she told Pierce that her pregnancy was a strategic financial decision guaranteeing her a payout regardless of how the marriage ended. The judge asked to see those messages on the courtroom screen. Jonathan projected them, and I watched Diana sink lower in her chair with each one. There was one message that made Judge Crawford remove her glasses and stare directly at Diana. From 8 months prior, where Diana told Pierce she was planning to reveal Max's true paternity when he was older, timing it to cause me maximum emotional damage during divorce proceedings. She discussed using a 6-year-old child as a psychological weapon. The judge asked Diana's lawyer if his client had any explanation. He requested a recess. The judge denied it and said she wanted to hear Diana's explanation immediately. Diana tried to claim the messages were taken out of context, that she'd been venting, that she never actually intended any of it, but Jonathan had documented a clear pattern spanning months. There was no way to reframe it. Then Ashley took the stand. She testified about conversations she'd overheard, about times she'd witnessed Pierce at our house, about Diana explicitly telling her she was waiting for my business acquisition to reach final settlement before filing. Ashley was emotional through most of her testimony, at one point apologizing directly to me. The judge asked Ashley whether she believed Diana's actions were in Max's best interest. Ashley looked at her sister and said no. She said Diana had been treating Max like a financial asset and that witnessing it had been devastating. Diana's lawyer attempted to discredit Ashley, suggesting she was biased or held some grudge. But Ashley had screenshots, specific dates, detailed accounts that corroborated everything Jonathan had presented. There was no question she was telling the truth. The judge took a 30-minute recess, and when she returned, her decision was written on her face. She started by saying this was one of the most calculated cases of parental fraud she'd encountered in 20 years on the bench. She said Diana had deliberately deceived me, deliberately used a child as a financial instrument, and had demonstrated a pattern of behavior that raised serious concerns about her judgment as a parent. The ruling was comprehensive. I received temporary primary custody of Max pending a full hearing in 3 months. Diana received supervised visitation 2 hours per week at a family center where a social worker would be present. She was prohibited from discussing Max's paternity with him without prior court approval. She was required to attend mandatory counseling, and if she violated any aspect of the custody order, her visitation would be suspended entirely. On the financial side, because I could demonstrate that the marriage had been based on fraudulent pretenses, the judge ruled that standard community property divisions wouldn't apply. Diana would receive a minimal settlement, essentially enough for her to relocate and start over, but nothing close to what she'd planned. No ongoing alimony. Since I had primary custody, I wouldn't be paying child support, and Pierce would be required to submit to court-ordered paternity testing, which would establish him as the biological father and make him financially responsible. Everything Diana had planned for years collapsed in a single 3-hour hearing. She tried to approach me after the ruling, mascara streaking down her face, saying she was sorry, asking if we could find some arrangement for Max's sake. I looked at her the same way I'd looked at her at that Christmas dinner, with complete emotional detachment. I walked out of that courthouse and drove straight to pick up Max from Ashley's house. When I walked in, Max ran to me the way he always did, arms stretched out, calling for Daddy. I picked him up and held him close, and Ashley had tears in her eyes. She told me I was a good father, and that Max was fortunate to have me. The full custody hearing 3 months later was almost anticlimactic. With everything already established and Diana having violated the communication restrictions twice during supervised visits, the judge made the arrangement permanent. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I started dating again. Nothing serious initially, just coffee meetings and casual dinners. Then I met someone who actually valued honesty in relationships. Someone who met Max and saw a kid, not a financial opportunity. Someone who understood what I'd been through and never once suggested I'd been foolish for not recognizing Diana's schemes sooner. About a year after everything concluded, I encountered Diana at a grocery store. She looked worn down, older, like the weight of her actions had finally settled on her. She attempted small talk, asked how Max was doing, mentioned relocating out of state for a fresh start. Before she walked away, she said she was sorry, genuinely sorry, that she'd destroyed everything and wished she could go back and make different choices. I believed she meant it. But I also understood that apologies don't undo years of calculated deception. Sorry doesn't return the time she stole or erase the fact that she'd been willing to destroy me for personal gain. I told her I hoped she found whatever she was looking for. Not because I'd forgiven her, but because I honestly didn't care anymore what happened to her. That night, I put Max to bed like always. He asked me to read his favorite book, the one about the bear who goes on adventures. Halfway through, he fell asleep with his hand holding mine. I sat there watching him breathe peacefully, thinking about how close I'd come to losing him. Diana had been right about one thing. Max was the most important thing in my life. She'd just been completely wrong about how far I'd go to protect him.